Picture this, a bitter February morning in 1887 Iowa, where the wind cuts through you like a knife and the snow lies 3 feet deep across the endless prairie. Margaret Maggie Sullivan, a 28-year-old widow with nothing but her late husband's debts and a determination forged in heartbreak, trudges through the wilderness toward what locals whisper is a cursed homestead. She's following smoke rising from a chimney that shouldn't exist, because the Hendricks family who built that cabin vanished without a trace 6 months ago. What she discovers inside that isolated log structure will challenge everything she thought she knew about family, survival, and the limits of human love. Because sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most impossible circumstances. And sometimes one woman's courage can transform 14 tiny lives into something miraculous. What happens next will echo through generations and prove that love isn't just about blood relations. It's about choice, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds we forge when we refuse to let others face the world alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that would change everything began like so many others. In the harsh winter of 1887, Margaret Sullivan stood at the frosted window of her cramped room above Miller's General Store in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, watching the endless expanse of white that had buried the prairie for 3 unforgiving months. Her breath fogged the glass as she pressed her forehead against the cold surface, fighting back the familiar wave of despair that threatened to overwhelm her each dawn. At 28, Maggie had already lived more heartbreak than most women experienced in a lifetime. 3 years had passed since consumption claimed her husband Patrick, leaving her with medical bills that consumed their small farm and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. The farm had been sold to pay the doctors, their dreams of children buried alongside Patrick in the frozen ground of Oak Hill Cemetery. Now she worked 16-hour days for Ezra Miller, sorting inventory and managing his books for wages barely sufficient to rent the tiny room where she spent her sleepless nights, remembering what it felt like to be loved. The other townspeople treated her with the polite distance reserved for women whose circumstances had fallen too far below respectable society's expectations. She was neither wife nor widow with property, neither maiden nor mother. She existed in the uncomfortable space between categories that made others uncertain how to treat her. But Maggie Sullivan possessed something that poverty and grief couldn't touch, an unshakable belief that purpose could be found even in the darkest circumstances. This morning, however, that belief was being tested by a conversation she'd overheard in the store the previous evening. 2 ranch hands from the Murphy spread had been discussing the mysterious smoke they'd spotted rising from the abandoned Hendricks homestead 15 miles northeast of town. The Hendricks family, Jonas, his wife Mary, and their 3 young children had simply vanished one autumn morning, leaving behind a cabin full of belongings and a mystery that had haunted the county all winter. "Ain't natural," one of the hands had muttered, shaking snow from his coat. "That place has been empty since October, but there's smoke coming from the chimney, regular as clockwork. Either the place is haunted, or someone's squatting there who don't want to be found. Could be Indians," the other had suggested nervously. "Maybe they took the family and are using the cabin as a winter camp." Ezra Miller had dismissed their concerns with typical gruffness. "Smoke's probably coming from lightning strikes or some such nonsense. You boys been drinking too much of Murphy's whiskey again." But Maggie had seen something in their eyes that spoke of genuine fear. And more troubling, she'd heard the unspoken question that hung in the air. What had happened to the Hendricks family? Jonas had been a good man, known throughout the county for his fair dealing and gentle manner with his children. Mary had been quiet but kind, always ready with a loaf of bread for families facing hard times. The children, little Emma, barely 6, and the twin boys Samuel and Seth, just 4 years old, had been bright-eyed and healthy when Maggie had last seen them at the Harvest Festival. Families didn't just disappear on the Iowa prairie. There were always traces Always stories, always someone who knew something. But the Hendricks case was different. No one had seen them leave. No one had found bodies. Their wagon remained in the barn, their horses in the pasture, until neighbors had finally collected them. It was as if they had simply stepped out of existence. The mystery had gnawed at Maggie through the long winter nights, partly because she understood what it meant to lose everything without warning, but mostly because something deep in her gut insisted that whatever had happened at the Hendricks place wasn't finished yet. The smoke the ranch hands described suggested someone or something was still there, and if there was even the smallest chance that the family was alive and in need of help, she couldn't ignore it. The decision formed in her mind with crystalline clarity as she watched the sunrise paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. She would ride out to the Hendricks homestead and discover the truth for herself. The 15-mile journey through winter wilderness would be dangerous for a woman traveling alone. But Maggie had learned that the greatest risks in life came from the choices you didn't make, not the ones you did. She dressed carefully in her warmest clothes, wool stockings, leather boots, her late husband's heavy coat that still carried the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, and a fur-lined hat that had belonged to her mother. Patrick's old Spencer rifle hung across her back, loaded and ready. She'd grown up on a farm and knew how to handle both the weapon and the harsh realities of frontier life. Miller grumbled about her request for the day off, but business was slow during the worst of winter, and Maggie had worked without complaint through Christmas and New Year's when other employees had taken time with their families. She promised to return by evening and left before he could voice further objections. The borrowed horse from Thompson's livery was a sturdy chestnut mare named Dolly, chosen for her reputation for sure footing in snow rather than speed. The animal seemed to sense the seriousness of their mission, stepping carefully through the drifts and responding instantly to Maggie's guidance as they left the safety of town behind. The prairie in winter was both beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. Miles of unbroken white stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional fence line or distant barn. The silence was absolute, except for the soft crunch of snow under Dolly's hooves and the whisper of wind across the frozen landscape. This was country that could kill an unprepared traveler in hours, where a wrong turn or sudden storm could mean death by exposure long before help could arrive. But Maggie had grown up in this harsh country and understood its moods. She read the sky like others read newspapers, noting the thin, high clouds that promised continued cold but no immediate precipitation. The wind came from the northwest, steady but not fierce enough to create the ground blizzards that could blind a rider and leave them wandering in circles until exhaustion claimed them as the morning progressed and the town disappeared behind the rolling hills. Maggie found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. She could have remarried after Patrick's death. There were men in town who would have offered security, if not passion. She could have moved back east to her sister's family in Pennsylvania, trading independence for the safety of familiar surroundings. Instead, she had chosen to remain in Iowa, working for wages that barely sustained her, clinging to a landscape that held more painful memories than hopeful prospects. Why? The question had tormented her through 3 years of grief and struggle. This morning, following smoke signals toward an abandoned homestead, she began to understand that she had stayed because leaving would have meant accepting that Patrick's dreams for their life together had died with him. By remaining in the place where they had planned to build their future, she kept alive the possibility that some version of those dreams might still be realized, even if in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The Hendricks homestead appeared on the horizon just after noon, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against a grove of oak trees that provided minimal shelter from the prairie winds. Smoke did indeed rise from the chimney in a thin, steady stream that spoke of a carefully tended fire rather than the random burning that might result from lightning or accident. Maggie dismounted a quarter mile from the cabin and led Dolly forward on foot, her rifle ready but not raised in an obviously threatening manner. The snow around the buildings showed clear signs of recent activity, paths worn between the cabin and barn, areas where firewood had been split and stacked, even what looked like the remains of a small snowman that children might have built. The silence was oppressive. No voices called out at her approach, no dogs barked warnings, no faces appeared at windows. Yet the evidence of habitation was undeniable. Someone was living in the abandoned Hendricks homestead, maintaining the property and keeping warm fires burning through the harsh winter. She tied Dolly to a fence post near the barn and approached the cabin with growing unease. The front door, sturdy oak that Jonas Hendricks had crafted himself, stood slightly ajar despite the freezing temperature. Through the gap, she could see the orange glow of firelight dancing on log walls, but no movement suggested the presence of occupants. "Hello," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Is anyone there? I'm here to help if you need assistance." The response came not as words, but as a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins, the thin, desperate crying of an infant in distress. Then another voice joined the first, and another, until a chorus of baby cries filled the air like some impossible symphony of need and abandonment. Maggie's rifle clattered to the ground as she rushed forward, pushing through the partially open door into the cabin's main room. What she discovered there defied every expectation and challenged every assumption she had made about what she might find. The Hendricks cabin had been transformed into something resembling a frontier nursery. Every piece of furniture had been repositioned to accommodate the care of children, with makeshift cribs constructed from wooden crates and padded with quilts and blankets. A large fire burned in the stone hearth, filling the room with warmth and light. Bottles and feeding supplies covered every available surface, along with stacks of cloth diapers and piles of tiny clothing in various stages of washing and drying. But it was the children themselves that stopped Maggie's heart and rewrote her understanding of what was possible in this world. 14 babies, ranging in age from what appeared to be newborn to perhaps 6 months old, lay in the improvised cribs or crawled across thick blankets spread on the wooden floor. All were clean, all appeared healthy despite their obvious distress, and all possessed the unmistakable features that marked them as twins. 7 perfect pairs of children who had somehow found their way to this isolated cabin. Standing in the center of this impossible scene was a figure Maggie recognized with shock, Mary Hendricks, but transformed almost beyond recognition. The quiet, reserved woman Maggie remembered from town gatherings was gone, replaced by someone who looked as if she had aged 10 years in the 6 months since her family's disappearance. Her brown hair hung loose and unkempt, her clothes were patched and worn, and her eyes held the exhausted desperation of someone who had been pushed far beyond normal human endurance. "Mary," Maggie breathed, unable to process what she was seeing. "Mary Hendricks? What in God's name is happening here?" Mary looked up from the infant she was attempting to soothe, and Maggie saw recognition flash across her features, followed immediately by something that might have been relief or terror. "Maggie Sullivan," Mary whispered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I prayed someone would come, but I never thought. How did you find us?" "The smoke," Maggie replied automatically, still staring at the incredible scene surrounding them. "Ranch hands spotted smoke from your chimney. Everyone thought the place was abandoned after you disappeared. Mary, where are Jonas and your children? And these babies? Dear Lord, where did all these babies come from?" Mary's composure cracked then, and she sank onto a wooden stool, the infant in her arms finally quieting as she rocked back and forth with practiced motions that spoke of months of experience. "They're gone," she said simply. "Jonas and the children, they took sick with fever in late September. All 3 of them, within a week of each other. I buried them myself in the grove behind the house." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. She had known the Hendricks children, had watched them play at community gatherings, had imagined them growing up in this wild country. The thought of Mary facing such loss alone, without even the comfort of neighbors to share her grief, was almost unbearable. "But why didn't you come to town?" Maggie asked. Why didn't you tell anyone? People would have helped because of them, Mary interrupted, gesturing to the babies surrounding them. Because the same week I lost my family, someone started leaving these children on my doorstep. One pair at a time, always twins, always in the middle of the night. 7 times over 3 months, someone brought me babies that no one else wanted or could care for. Maggie stared at the 14 small faces, beginning to understand the impossible situation Mary had faced. Someone was abandoning twin babies at your cabin? Not abandoning, Mary corrected firmly. Bringing them to safety. Each time, there was a note explaining the circumstances. Mothers who died in childbirth with no family to take the children. Families who couldn't afford to feed additional mouths during the harsh winter. Women who had no choice but to give up their babies or watch them starve. She reached into a wooden box beside her stool and withdrew a handful of worn paper scraps covered in different handwriting. Read these, she said, handing them to Maggie. Tell me what you would have done. Maggie took the notes with trembling hands and read by the firelight. Each one told a story of desperation and impossible choices. These are Sarah and Samuel, born to my daughter who died bringing them into the world. I'm too old and poor to raise them properly, but I cannot bear to watch them suffer. Another read. Emma and Eleanor's father was killed in a mining accident. I have 4 other children and no means to feed them all. Please give these little ones the chance at life I cannot provide. One by one, the notes revealed the harsh mathematics of frontier survival. Each pair of twins represented a family pushed beyond its ability to provide, parents making the most heartbreaking choice imaginable in hopes their children might somehow survive. And somehow word had spread through the network of desperate families that Mary Hendricks, isolated in her grief, might be their answer. I couldn't turn them away, Mary said quietly as Maggie finished reading. The first pair arrived 3 days after I buried my Emma. I was sitting by their graves wanting to die myself when I heard crying from the front porch. 2 tiny babies, barely a week old, with a note begging someone to give them the love their mother couldn't provide. She paused, gazing at the infant in her arms with an expression of fierce protectiveness. Taking care of them gave me a reason to keep living. But Maggie, I'm at the end of my strength. 14 babies require more than one woman can provide, no matter how determined she might be. I haven't slept more than an hour at a time in months. The supplies I had stored for my own family's winter are almost gone. And spring is still weeks away. The full scope of the crisis finally became clear to Maggie. Mary Hendricks had transformed her grief into purpose, creating a sanctuary for unwanted children in the isolation of her abandoned homestead. But the very isolation that made it possible also made it unsustainable. Without help, both Mary and the 14 babies would likely die before winter's end. Why didn't you bring them to town? Maggie asked. Surely someone would have what? Mary's laugh was bitter. Taken 14 orphaned babies? Split them up among families who might resent the burden? Put them in an orphanage where they'd be separated from their twin siblings and raised as charity cases? Or would the town have decided that an unmarried woman caring for children she couldn't account for was evidence of moral corruption that required investigation? The harsh truth of Mary's words silenced Maggie's protests. Frontier communities operated on carefully maintained social structures that provided stability in harsh circumstances. But those same structures offered little flexibility for situations that fell outside normal expectations. A woman, alone with 14 babies, would raise questions that could easily lead to the children being taken away and distributed among reluctant families, destroying the bonds they had formed with each other and with Mary. There has to be a way, Maggie said, though she couldn't yet imagine what that way might look like. We can't let these babies suffer because their situation is complicated. Mary stood and moved to one of the cribs, where a pair of identical baby girls were beginning to fuss. That's what I told myself every day for 3 months, she said, lifting both babies with practiced efficiency. But wanting to help and being able to help are different things. I love these children as if they were my own, but love doesn't provide food or medicine or proper shelter. It doesn't create the money needed to care for 14 growing children, and it doesn't solve the problem of what happens when people start asking questions I can't answer. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the cabin walls. Mary's face went white with terror. "No one knows this place is occupied," she whispered urgently. "If someone's coming here, it means trouble." Maggie moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, their horses moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than casual exploration. She recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Ben Crawford, a decent man, but one who followed the letter of the law with unwavering determination. "It's the sheriff," she told Mary, whose expression grew even more frightened. "Someone must have reported the smoke or seen me riding out here." "They'll take the babies," Mary said with quiet desperation. "They'll split them up or send them to institutions where twins are separated as a matter of policy. These children will lose each other, and they'll never know the love that brought them together." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Maggie realized she was facing the most important decision of her life. She could step outside and explain the situation to Sheriff Crawford, hoping that official channels might provide some solution for Mary and the babies. Or she could choose to become part of whatever came next, accepting responsibility for a situation that would forever change the direction of her own life. Looking at the 14 small faces surrounding her, each pair of twins representing someone's desperate hope for a better future, Maggie Sullivan made her choice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mary, listen to me carefully," Maggie whispered urgently as the hoofbeats grew closer. "How much do these babies mean to you?" "More than my own life," Mary replied without hesitation, clutching the twin girls protectively against her chest. "Then we're going to fight for them, together." What happened next would require more courage than either woman had ever summoned. But it would also forge a partnership that would transform not just their own lives, but the future of 14 innocent children who deserved more than the world seemed willing to give them. Maggie stepped outside to meet Sheriff Crawford before he could reach the cabin door, her mind racing through possible explanations that might protect Mary and the babies. The sheriff was accompanied by 2 deputies, Tom Bradley, a young man barely out of his teens who took his duties seriously, and Frank Morrison, a weathered veteran who had seen enough frontier justice to understand that situations were rarely as simple as they first appeared. "Miss Sullivan," Sheriff Crawford said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Ezra Miller said you'd ridden out this way. Folks been worried about you traveling alone in this weather, especially to a place with such an odd reputation. I appreciate the concern." "Sheriff," Maggie replied, positioning herself so the men couldn't see directly into the cabin, "I came to investigate the reports about smoke from the chimney. Seemed like someone should check on things." Deputy Morrison dismounted and walked closer to the cabin, his experienced eyes taking in details that others might miss. The carefully split firewood, the paths worn in the snow, the general signs of long-term habitation rather than temporary shelter. "This place has been occupied for months, not days," he observed. "Someone's been living here regular since before the heavy snow started." From inside the cabin came the unmistakable sound of infant crying, quickly muffled, but not before all 3 men heard it clearly. Sheriff Crawford's expression grew troubled. "Miss Sullivan, is there something you'd like to tell us about what you found here?" Maggie felt the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She could lie, try to convince the sheriff that she'd heard nothing unusual, but men like Crawford and Morrison weren't easily deceived. They would investigate further, and the truth would emerge in ways that might be far worse for Mary and the babies. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "what I'm about to show you is going to challenge everything you think you know about right and wrong. Before you make any official decisions, I need you to see the whole situation and understand what's really at stake here. Crawford studied her face with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading people's intentions. That sounds like you're asking me to bend the law, Miss Sullivan. You know I can't do that, no matter how compelling the circumstances might be. I'm asking you to see the situation before you decide what the law requires, Maggie replied. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same, and sometimes a man's true character is measured by which one he chooses when he has to. Pick. The sheriff's weathered face showed the internal struggle of a man who had dedicated his life to upholding order, but had learned that order without compassion could become its own form of injustice. Show me, he said finally. Maggie led the three men into the cabin, and their reactions to what they found revealed everything about their characters. Deputy Bradley stepped backward in shock, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon, as if the babies represented some kind of threat. Deputy Morrison removed his hat and whistled low under his breath, his eyes taking in the scope of the situation with growing comprehension. Sheriff Crawford simply stood silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the 14 babies to Mary Hendricks, who sat frozen with fear in the center of the impossible scene. Mrs. Hendricks, the sheriff said finally, his voice gentle despite the authority it carried. I think you'd better tell us what's been happening here. Mary's story emerged in halting sentences punctuated by the constant demands of caring for 14 babies who needed feeding, changing and comforting on schedules that never seemed to align. She explained about losing her own family to fever, about the mysterious arrival of twin after twin throughout the autumn and early winter, about her growing realization that someone in the county was using her isolated grief as a solution for families facing impossible choices. You're telling us that 7 different families brought you babies over 3 months, and you took them all in without reporting any of this to authorities? Deputy Bradley asked, his voice reflecting the disbelief of someone whose worldview didn't accommodate such complexity. I'm telling you that 7 families trusted me with their most precious possessions when they had nowhere else to turn, Mary replied with quiet dignity. I'm telling you that these children would have died if I hadn't been here to take them, and they'll die now if they're separated from each other and from the only stable care they've known. Deputy Morrison walked among the makeshift cribs, his experienced eyes noting details that spoke to the quality of care Mary had provided. The babies were clean, healthy, and well-fed, despite the obviously challenging circumstances. The improvised nursery showed signs of careful planning and constant attention. Most importantly, the twin pairs showed the kind of bonding that only occurred when children received consistent, loving care from the same caregiver. Sheriff, Morrison said quietly, I've seen how children look when they've been neglected or abused. These babies show none of those signs. Whatever else is happening here, these children are being cared for better than many I've seen in established households. Sheriff Crawford was studying the notes that Mary had preserved, each one telling its story of desperation and impossible choices. Mrs. Hendricks, you understand that we can't just pretend we haven't discovered this situation. There are legal requirements for reporting abandoned children, procedures for ensuring their welfare, systems in place to handle these kinds of circumstances. And what do those systems suggest should happen to 14 babies who arrive as 7 sets of twins? Maggie asked, stepping forward to stand beside Mary. Will the county split them up among different families? Send them to institutions where twins are routinely separated. Place them with people who see them as burdens rather than blessings. Miss Sullivan, you're not qualified to make decisions about what's best for these children, Deputy Bradley protested. There are proper authorities, people trained to handle these situations, trained to handle 1 or 2 children at a time, not 14 babies who need specialized care, Maggie shot back. Trained to follow procedures that assume normal circumstances, not the extraordinary situation we're facing here. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by a development that changed everything. The sound of approaching wagons reached them through the cabin walls, not the single horses of law enforcement, but the heavier rumbling of multiple vehicles carrying substantial loads. Through the window, they could see a small convoy approaching, 3 wagons loaded with supplies and accompanied by riders on horseback. At the head of the group rode a figure that made Mary gasp with recognition and relief. "Dr. Elizabeth Warner," Mary breathed. "Thank God she got my message." Sheriff Crawford turned to Mary with raised eyebrows. "You sent word to someone about this situation?" 3 days ago, when I realized I was running out of supplies and options," Mary admitted. "Dr. Warner has been treating difficult cases throughout the county for 5 years. If anyone would understand what we're facing here and know how to help, it would be her." Dr. Elizabeth Warner was something of a legend in central Iowa, a woman who had trained as a physician back east, but had chosen to practice medicine on the frontier where her skills were desperately needed. She treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay, had delivered hundreds of babies under the most challenging circumstances, and had gained a reputation for finding creative solutions to problems that others considered impossible. More importantly, for their current situation, Dr. Warner had connections throughout the medical and social service communities across multiple states. If anyone could navigate the legal and practical challenges of caring for 14 orphaned babies, it would be her. The convoy came to a halt outside the cabin, and Dr. Warner dismounted with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements. She was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Behind her came assistants unloading supplies that included medical equipment, food stores, clothing, and what appeared to be additional cribs and baby furniture. "Mrs. Hendricks," Dr. Warner called as she approached the cabin. "I received your letter and came as quickly as the weather allowed. I brought everything I could think of, and I've telegraphed colleagues in Des Moines and Chicago who specialize in child welfare issues." She stopped short when she saw Sheriff Crawford and his deputies. "Gentlemen, I hope your presence here doesn't indicate that you're planning to disrupt the remarkable work that Mrs. Hendricks has been doing." "Doctor," Sheriff Crawford replied respectfully, "we're trying to understand a very complex situation and determine what the law requires us to do about it." Dr. Warner's laugh was sharp, but not unkind. "Sheriff, the law was written by men who never imagined a situation like this one. Sometimes we have to create new precedents when old rules prove inadequate to address extraordinary circumstances." She brushed past the men and entered the cabin, her professional assessment of the situation immediate and thorough. Moving from crib to crib, she examined each baby with practiced efficiency, noting their general health, signs of proper nutrition, and evidence of the kind of consistent care that fostered healthy development. "Remarkable," she murmured as she completed her examination. "Mrs. Hendricks, you've managed to provide better care for these children than many established institutions could offer. The twins are all healthy, well bonded to each other, and showing normal development patterns. This is truly extraordinary work." "Doctor," Deputy Bradley interjected, "surely you're not suggesting that an untrained woman living in isolation is better equipped to care for 14 babies than proper authorities?" Dr. Warner turned to face him with the kind of smile that suggested she was about to deliver an education he wouldn't forget. "Deputy, I've visited institutions in 3 states that specialize in caring for orphaned children. I've seen the conditions, the overcrowding, the lack of individual attention, and most tragically, the systematic separation of sibling groups, including twins." She gestured toward the babies surrounding them. "What Mrs. Hendricks has created here is something I've never seen before. A family unit that preserves the bond between twin siblings while providing the kind of individualized care that these children need to thrive. Destroying this would be criminal, regardless of what your procedural manuals might say." Sheriff Crawford was beginning to understand that he was dealing with forces beyond his usual experience. Doctor, even if we accept that Mrs. Hendricks has provided excellent care, she can't possibly continue managing 14 babies alone indefinitely. The physical and financial demands would break down any single person, which is why I'm here, Dr. Warner replied, and why I've been corresponding with people throughout the region who understand the significance of what we're dealing with here. She moved to one of the wagons and returned with a thick folder of documents. I've spent the past 3 days researching legal precedents for situations involving multiple orphaned children, and I've discovered something interesting. There are provisions in territorial law for the establishment of specialized care facilities when circumstances warrant them. Opening the folder, she withdrew several official-looking documents. What I'm proposing is the creation of the first officially recognized twin family sanctuary in the Iowa Territory. Mrs. Hendricks would be appointed as the director, with proper legal authority and financial support, to provide specialized care for multiple sets of twins who require placement together. The implications of Dr. Warner's proposal began to sink in. Rather than trying to hide or defend an irregular situation, she was suggesting they transform it into something official and replicable. Instead of seeing the 14 babies as a problem to be solved, she was treating them as the foundation for a new approach to child welfare that could serve as a model for other communities. "You're talking about creating an institution," Maggie said slowly, beginning to understand the full scope of what Dr. Warner envisioned. "Not an institution in the traditional sense," Dr. Warner corrected. "I'm talking about creating a family-based care system that recognizes the unique needs of twin children while providing the support structure necessary to sustain high-quality care." She turned to Sheriff Crawford. "Sheriff, I have letters from the Territorial Governor's Office, the Iowa Children's Welfare Commission, and 3 different medical colleges expressing support for this experimental approach. What Mrs. Hendricks has accidentally created here could revolutionize how we care for orphaned children throughout the entire frontier region." The weight of this revelation settled over everyone in the cabin. What had begun as a desperate woman's response to impossible circumstances had attracted the attention of people with the power to transform it into something far greater than anyone had imagined possible. But even as the scope of the opportunity became clear, practical challenges remained. 14 babies required enormous resources, specialized knowledge, and a level of organization that went far beyond what Mary had been managing through sheer determination and love. "Dr. Warner," Mary said quietly, "even with official support, I don't know if I have the strength to continue what I've been doing. These past months have pushed me beyond what I thought was humanly possible, which is why you won't be doing it alone," Dr. Warner replied, then turned to look directly at Maggie. "Miss Sullivan, Mrs. Hendricks tells me you've already made the choice to stand with these children. I'm hoping you'll consider making that choice permanent." Maggie felt all eyes in the room focusing on her, but none more intently than Mary's, the woman who had sacrificed everything to save 14 babies, was silently asking if she would have a partner in the monumental task that lay ahead. The choice would mean abandoning her simple life in town, leaving behind the security of regular wages and predictable routines. It would mean taking responsibility for 14 growing children who would need not just immediate care, but education, guidance, and preparation for their own futures. It would mean becoming part of something unprecedented and uncertain, with no guarantee of success. Looking at the faces of the 14 babies, each pair of twins representing someone's desperate hope for a better future, Maggie Sullivan made the second life-changing decision of this extraordinary day. "Dr. Warner," she said firmly, "what do we need to do to make this work?" The transformation of the Hendricks homestead from abandoned cabin to functioning sanctuary began with what Dr. Warner called organized chaos. Within hours of the official decision to establish the twin family sanctuary, the small clearing buzzed with activity that would have seemed impossible just days before. Maggie found herself thrust into a world of logistics and planning that bore no resemblance to her previous life of simple routines and predictable challenges. Dr. Warner had arrived with more than just medical supplies and moral support. She had brought a network of professionals, volunteers, and resources that revealed the scope of what they were attempting to build. The first priority was immediate expansion of living space. The original Hendricks cabin, while sturdy, could barely accommodate 14 babies and 2 adult caretakers, let alone the additional staff and facilities that would be required for a functioning sanctuary. Dr. Warner's convoy had included 2 master carpenters from Des Moines, Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant whose reputation for solid construction was matched only by his gentle way with children, and James Patterson, a former ship's carpenter whose creative problem-solving skills had been legendary on the Great Lakes. "What we're building here has never been attempted before," Patterson explained to Maggie as they walked the perimeter of the property, planning the expansion. "We need structures that can house multiple families of twins while maintaining the intimate, home-like atmosphere that makes Mrs. Hendricks' approach so successful." Miller, examining the existing cabin with professional appreciation, pointed out modifications that could be made immediately. "The foundation is sound, the roof is excellent, but we must add wings that connect but remain distinct. Each set of twins needs space to grow together, while the overall family remains unified." Their vision was ambitious: a main building that would expand the current cabin into a proper residence for Mary and Maggie, flanked by 2 family wings, where older children could have semi-independent living spaces while remaining under supervision. A separate nursery building would house the youngest babies, with design features that allowed for individual twin bonding while facilitating efficient care by multiple caretakers. But the physical construction represented only one aspect of the challenges they faced. Dr. Warner had spent her 3 days of travel developing what she called a comprehensive support framework that addressed everything from legal recognition to financial sustainability to staffing requirements. "Miss Sullivan," Dr. Warner said as they sat around the expanded kitchen table that first evening, surrounded by architectural drawings and legal documents, "I need you to understand that what we're creating will require skills and commitments far beyond what either you or Mrs. Hendricks have had to develop in your previous lives." She opened a thick folder containing correspondence with officials throughout the territory. "I've secured provisional approval for the sanctuary from the territorial governor, but that approval comes with requirements. We must demonstrate that we can provide education equivalent to public schools, medical care that meets territorial standards, and record-keeping that satisfies legal authorities about the welfare of every child in our care." Mary, holding one of the youngest babies while managing to feed another, looked up from her constant multitasking. "Dr. Warner, I've kept these children alive and healthy for months with nothing but determination and whatever supplies I could manage. Surely we can handle formal requirements if we have proper support." "The challenge isn't your dedication or competence, Mrs. Hendricks," Dr. Warner replied gently. "The challenge is scaling up from survival mode to sustainable operation mode. What you've accomplished is remarkable, but it's also exhausting and ultimately unsustainable without systematic support." She pulled out a chart that laid out staffing requirements for their planned expansion. "Based on my research of similar institutions, we'll need a minimum of 6 full-time staff members to properly care for 14 children, 2 primary caretakers, 1 cook and housekeeper, 1 educator, 1 medical assistant, and 1 administrative coordinator." The numbers were daunting. Even with Dr. Warner's connections and the territorial government's support, finding 6 qualified people willing to relocate to an isolated homestead in central Iowa would be challenging. More challenging still would be generating the income necessary to pay their salaries, along with the costs of food, clothing, medical care, and education for 16 people. "Where does the money come from?" Maggie asked, voicing the question that had been troubling her since Dr. Warner first outlined the scope of their plans. Multiple sources, Dr. Warner replied, withdrawing another set of documents. I've already secured commitments for partial funding from 3 different sources. The Territorial Education Department, which will provide support equivalent to what they spend per student in public schools. The Medical College in Iowa City, which wants to fund research into child development among twins. And the Lutheran Children's Aid Society, which has agreed to provide general operating funds in exchange for our accepting children from their network. She paused, studying both women's faces carefully before continuing. But the largest portion of our funding will need to come from private donations. And that means we need to tell our story in ways that inspire people to support what we're doing. This revelation introduced an entirely new dimension to their challenge. It wasn't enough to provide excellent care for the children. They would also need to become advocates and fundraisers, convincing strangers throughout the region that their experimental sanctuary deserved financial support. How do we convince people to support something that's never been tried before? Maggie asked. By proving that it works, Dr. Warner replied simply, and by demonstrating that the alternative, separating twin siblings and placing them in traditional institutions, produces inferior outcomes for the children involved. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of yet another wagon, this one carrying supplies that Dr. Warner had ordered from Chicago, educational materials, specialized baby furniture, and most intriguingly, a camera and photographic equipment operated by a serious young man named Robert Chen. Documentation will be crucial to our success, Dr. Warner explained as Chen began setting up his equipment. We need to create a visual record of what we're accomplishing here, both for our own use in improving our methods and for sharing with potential supporters who need to see the results of their contributions. The photo session that followed revealed something that none of them had fully appreciated during the chaos of survival mode. The 14A babies had formed distinct personalities and relationships that went far beyond simple twin bonding. Each pair of siblings showed unique characteristics and interaction patterns that demonstrated the kind of individual attention they had received despite the challenging circumstances. Samuel and Seth, the most active of the boys, had developed their own communication system of gestures and sounds that allowed them to coordinate their exploration of their shared crib. Emma and Eleanor seemed to take turns being fussy, as if they had unconsciously agreed to ensure that only one would demand attention at any given time. The youngest pair, Maria and Michael, moved in perfect synchronization even in their sleep, their tiny hands always reaching toward each other. This is remarkable, Chen observed as he captured image after image of the children's interactions. I've photographed children in institutions throughout the Midwest, and I've never seen the kind of individual development and sibling bonding that these babies are displaying. His professional assessment carried weight beyond simple observation. Chen had been commissioned by several universities to document child development in various settings, and his expertise in recognizing healthy versus problematic development patterns made his evaluation particularly valuable. Dr. Warner, he said as he packed his equipment for the day, you need to understand that what Mrs. Hendricks has created here represents a revolutionary approach to child welfare. The development patterns I'm seeing suggest that these children are thriving in ways that traditional orphanages simply cannot replicate. That evening, as they reviewed Chen's photographs by lamplight, the full scope of their accomplishment began to emerge. The images showed not just well-cared-for babies, but children who displayed the kind of secure attachment and confident exploration that indicated optimal emotional development. We're not just taking care of orphans, Mary said softly, studying a photograph of herself surrounded by all 14 babies. We're raising children who will grow up believing they're valued and loved. Children who will remember that someone fought for their right to stay together. But even as they celebrated their success, practical challenges continued to mount. The expansion construction had revealed problems with the property's water supply that would require significant investment to resolve. The approaching spring meant that roads would become impassable for weeks, cutting off their supply lines just as their needs were increasing. Most concerning, several of the babies were showing signs of minor developmental delays that would require specialized intervention. Dr. Warner addressed these challenges with characteristic directness. Ladies, we're at a critical juncture. We can continue operating in crisis mode, managing each problem as it arises, or we can take the significant step of truly professionalizing our operation. She opened her final folder of the evening, revealing documents that would change everything once again. I've received a formal offer from the Iowa Children's Welfare Commission. They want to provide full funding for our operation, including salaries, construction costs, and all ongoing expenses. In exchange, they want us to accept their oversight and agree to serve as a model program that could be replicated throughout the territorial system. The offer was generous beyond anything they had dared hope for, but it came with implications that would fundamentally alter their relationship with the children and their autonomy in making decisions about the sanctuary's operation. What kind of oversight? Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would complicate their simple desire to provide the best possible care for the children. Regular inspections, standardized procedures, reporting requirements, and most significantly, acceptance of children assigned to us by territorial authorities rather than our current practice of taking in children as circumstances. Bring them to us. The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of competing priorities. The funding would solve their immediate problems and ensure long-term sustainability, but it would also transform their family-like sanctuary into something more resembling a government institution. There's another option, Dr. Warner continued, but it would require even more courage and commitment than you've already shown. She withdrew a final document, one that she had clearly been reluctant to present until she was certain of their dedication. I've also received an offer from a private foundation established by wealthy families in Chicago and St. Louis, whose own twins have thrived under specialized care. They're prepared to provide equivalent funding with minimal oversight, but they want something that may be even more challenging. What do they want? Mary asked. They want us to prove that our approach can be scaled up. They want us to accept not just 14 children, but eventually grow to accommodate 50 or more. Sets of twins while maintaining the same level of individual attention and family-like atmosphere. The proposal was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. They would be creating not just a sanctuary, but an entirely new model for child welfare that could transform how society approached the care of orphaned and abandoned children throughout the American frontier. Dr. Warner, Maggie said slowly, are you asking us to build something that's never existed before, based on 3 months of experience caring for 14 babies? Miss Sullivan, Dr. Warner replied with a smile that mixed encouragement with challenge, I'm asking you to trust that what you've already accomplished is evidence that you're capable of accomplishing something even greater. The decision would affect not just their own lives, but the futures of dozens of children who would depend on them for everything from basic survival to preparation for adulthood. It would require skills they had never developed, resources they could barely imagine, and a level of commitment that would consume the rest of their lives. As Maggie looked around the cabin at the 14 sleeping babies who had already transformed her understanding of what was possible, she realized that the choice had already been made. The moment she had decided to step inside and help Mary, she had committed to seeing their story through to whatever end it might reach. Dr. Warner, she said firmly, tell the Foundation we accept their offer, and tell them we'll prove that love and determination can accomplish things that money and institutions never could. The die was cast. They would build not just a sanctuary, but an empire of joy that would change the lives of children throughout the frontier. The only question now was whether they had the strength and wisdom to make their impossible dream a reality. The spring of 1888 brought more than just melting snow and muddy roads to the Hendricks homestead. It brought the first real test of whether their ambitious plans could survive contact with the harsh realities of frontier life and bureaucratic scrutiny. The foundation funding had arrived, but with it came expectations that would challenge everything Maggie and Mary thought they understood about caring for children. The crisis began with what should have been a celebration. Dr. Warner had arranged for a delegation of officials from the Chicago Foundation to visit and observe their operation firsthand. The delegation included philanthropist William Bradford, whose own twin daughters had inspired his interest in specialized childcare. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a child development specialist from Northwestern University, and most intimidatingly, Mrs. Cordelia Whitman, a social reformer whose articles about child welfare had influenced policy throughout the Midwest. Maggie had spent weeks preparing for the visit, working with Mary to document their daily routines, educational activities, and health monitoring procedures. The expanded facilities were nearly complete, with the new nursery building offering specialized spaces for different age groups and the family wings providing room for growth as the children matured. But on the morning the delegation was scheduled to arrive, disaster struck in the form of what Dr. Warner grimly diagnosed as whooping cough among 3 of the youngest babies. "This changes everything," Dr. Warner said as she completed her examination of Maria, Michael, and little David, one of the newer arrivals. "Whooping cough can be fatal in infants this young, and it's highly contagious. We need to implement immediate quarantine procedures. The timing couldn't have been worse." Mrs. Whitman and her colleagues were traveling from Chicago, specifically to evaluate whether the foundation should continue funding their experimental sanctuary. Canceling the visit would raise questions about their competence and reliability. Proceeding with sick babies would expose them to accusations of endangering the children for financial reasons. "We can't hide this," Maggie said, though every instinct screamed against admitting problems to evaluators who held their future in their hands. "If we're asking people to trust us with their most precious children, we have to be completely honest about both our successes and our challenges." Mary, holding one of the affected babies while he struggled with the characteristic coughing fits, nodded reluctantly. "But if they see children this sick, they'll assume we don't know what we're doing. 3 months of work could be destroyed in a single day." The debate was settled by the arrival of the delegation a full day early, their carriages appearing through the morning mist, while Dr. Warner was still implementing quarantine procedures. There was no time for discussion or preparation. They would face their evaluation in the midst of their first serious crisis. William Bradford emerged from the lead carriage with the bearing of a man, accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. His wealth had built railroads and banks, but his personal investment in their project stemmed from watching his own twin daughters struggle in traditional educational settings that failed to accommodate their unique bond and learning styles. Dr. Sinclair followed. Her professional demeanor immediately focused on assessing the children's environment and care standards. As one of the few female physicians specializing in child development, her opinion would carry enormous weight in determining whether their approach represented genuine innovation or dangerous experimentation. Mrs. Whitman stepped down last, her sharp eyes already cataloging details that would inform her eventual report to the Foundation Board. Her reputation for uncompromising standards had shut down several institutions she deemed inadequate, and her approval was considered essential for any child welfare program seeking serious support. "Mr. Bradford, Dr. Sinclair, Mrs. Whitman," Dr. Warner greeted them formally, her usual confidence tempered by the circumstances. "I need to inform you immediately that we're dealing with a medical situation that may affect your ability to complete a full evaluation today. Rather than explaining from a distance, she led them directly to the quarantine area where Maggie and Mary were providing round-the-clock care for the 3 affected babies. The sight that greeted the evaluators was not the orderly demonstration they had expected, but something far more revealing: 2 women who had been awake for 36 hours straight, maintaining constant vigilance over sick children while continuing to care for 11 healthy babies who couldn't understand why their routine had been disrupted. Whooping cough. Dr. Sinclair diagnosed immediately, her professional training evident in how quickly she assessed the situation. "How long since onset, and what treatment protocols are you following?" 48 hours since the first symptoms appeared, Dr. Warner replied. "We've isolated the affected children, increased humidity in their environment, and we're providing constant monitoring to prevent complications." Mrs. Whitman studied the quarantine setup with the critical eye of someone who had seen too many institutions, where crisis revealed fundamental inadequacies. But what she observed was the opposite: a carefully organized response that prioritized both the sick children's immediate needs and the healthy children's ongoing care. "Miss Sullivan," she said, addressing Maggie directly, "you look exhausted. How are you maintaining care standards when dealing with this level of stress?" The question was clearly a test, but Maggie was too tired and worried to craft a diplomatic response. "Mrs. Whitman, we're not maintaining our usual standards, we're exceeding them. When children are sick, they need more attention, not less. If that means Mary and I don't sleep until they're out of danger, then that's what we do." She gestured toward the healthy babies, who were being tended by Heinrich Müller and James Patterson, the carpenters who had stayed on as temporary assistants. "We don't abandon the children who aren't sick, but we also don't abandon the ones who are. Every child in this sanctuary matters equally." William Bradford, who had been silently observing the interaction between his sick daughter Maria and her twin brother Michael, suddenly spoke. "Dr. Sinclair, look at this." He pointed to how Michael had positioned himself as close to the quarantine barrier as possible, his tiny hand reaching toward his sister through the slats of their modified cribs. Despite being healthy, he was showing signs of distress that clearly stemmed from separation from his twin. "Fascinating," Dr. Sinclair murmured, taking notes rapidly. "In institutional settings, we typically separate sick children completely to prevent contagion. But you've created a system that maintains twin bonding while implementing necessary medical precautions. The children's emotional health is as important as their physical health," Mary explained, her voice hoarse from exhaustion but steady with conviction. "Separating twins completely can cause psychological trauma that lasts far longer than any physical illness." What followed was unlike any institutional evaluation any of them had experienced. Instead of formal presentations and staged demonstrations, the delegation found themselves drawn into the real work of caring for sick children while maintaining a functioning household for the healthy ones. Mrs. Whitman, despite her reputation for maintaining professional distance, ended up feeding breakfast to 3 babies while Maggie dealt with a particularly severe coughing episode. Dr. Sinclair documented everything, but her notes focused on the innovative approaches to maintaining twin bonds during medical crises rather than any deficiencies in their procedures. Bradford proved most surprising of all. The wealthy industrialist who could have afforded any luxury took turns walking the floors with fussy babies, his expensive clothes forgotten as he provided the kind of hands-on care that his money typically paid others to deliver. "This is remarkable," he said during a brief break, while the afternoon sun streamed through the nursery windows. "I visited institutions that spend more on administration than you spend on everything. But I've never seen children receive this level of individual attention during a crisis." The real test came on the second night, when little David's condition deteriorated rapidly. His breathing became labored, his fever spiked, and Dr. Warner made the grim assessment that he was entering the dangerous phase of the illness where infant mortality rates climbed dramatically. We need to consider whether he requires hospital treatment, Dr. Warner said quietly. Though everyone understood that the nearest hospital was a day's journey away and lacked the specialized equipment that might make the difference. What would a hospital provide that we can't? Dr. Sinclair asked, her professional curiosity engaged despite the emotional weight of the situation. Better ventilation equipment, possibly, and access to experimental treatments, Dr. Warner replied. But they would also separate him completely from his twin sister, and they lack the kind of constant personal attention he's receiving here. The debate over David's treatment became a microcosm of larger questions about their entire approach. Traditional medical thinking emphasized technological resources and professional credentials. Their sanctuary emphasized personal relationships and individualized care. Which approach would better serve a critically ill baby? The answer came from an unexpected source. David's twin sister Emma, despite being healthy and housed separately, began showing signs of severe distress as her brother's condition worsened. She refused to eat, cried inconsolably, and seemed to be declining in parallel with David despite showing no symptoms of illness. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Sinclair admitted as she observed Emma's deterioration. "It's as if she's experiencing sympathetic symptoms with her twin's illness, Mary." Drawing on months of experience with the children's interconnected relationships, made a decision that horrified Dr. Warner but proved transformative. "We're moving Emma into the quarantine area with David. If they're going to get through this, they need to do it together." The medical risks were obvious and significant. Emma could contract whooping cough, potentially doubling their casualties. If both twins became critically ill simultaneously, their limited resources would be stretched beyond capacity. But the emotional and psychological benefits became apparent immediately. Emma's distress disappeared the moment she could see and touch her brother. David's breathing seemed to ease when his sister was close enough for him to sense her presence. Both children slept more peacefully and responded better to treatment when they were together. "This challenges everything I thought I knew about quarantine procedures," Dr. Sinclair said, documenting the twins' improved responses. "But the evidence is undeniable. Their recovery is progressing faster together than David's was declining alone." The crisis lasted 6 days, during which the Foundation delegation became temporary residents of the sanctuary, sharing the daily routines of feeding, cleaning, medicating, and comforting children around the clock. By the time David and Emma were declared out of danger, the evaluators had experienced firsthand what made their approach different from traditional institutions. "Mrs. Sullivan," William Bradford said as they prepared for departure, "they came here expecting to evaluate whether you could manage the business of caring for children. Instead, I discovered that you're pioneering an entirely new understanding of what children need to thrive." Mrs. Whitman's final assessment proved equally supportive, though characteristically direct. "Your methods are unconventional, your resources are limited, and your facility would fail half the standard institutional evaluations. But your outcomes with these children represent the best child welfare work I've seen in 20 years of advocacy." Dr. Sinclair's academic report would eventually be published in 3 different medical journals, establishing their twin sanctuary as a case study in innovative child development practices. But her personal assessment, delivered privately to Maggie and Mary, carried even greater significance. "You've proven that love and attention can accomplish things that money and credentials cannot," she said. "More importantly, you've demonstrated that children's emotional needs are as critical as their physical needs, and that separating twins for administrative convenience causes genuine harm." The Foundation's decision arrived by telegraph 2 weeks later. Full funding, approved for expansion to accommodate 50 sets of twins, with additional grants for research documentation and staff training. They had not only survived their first major crisis, but had used it to demonstrate the validity of their entire approach. But success brought new challenges that would test their commitment in ways they had never anticipated. The expansion would require recruiting and training staff who shared their philosophy, managing relationships with families throughout the region who sought placement for their twin children, and maintaining their family-like atmosphere while operating on an institutional scale. Standing in the nursery, where 14 babies had become the foundation for something unprecedented, Maggie realized that their real work was just beginning. They had proven they could save children who might otherwise be lost. Now they had to prove they could build something lasting that would continue saving children long after they were gone. The autumn of 1888 brought changes to the twin family sanctuary that transformed it from an experimental project into something resembling a small village. The foundation funding had enabled construction of 4 additional buildings, staff quarters for 12 employees, and educational facilities that rivaled those of established schools in major cities. But with growth came complications that no amount of planning could have anticipated. Maggie stood in the central courtyard of what locals had begun calling Sullivan's City, watching 26 children ranging in age from infancy to 3 years old, playing under the supervision of their newly hired staff. The original 14 babies had grown into toddlers with distinct personalities and relationships that defied every conventional wisdom about institutional childcare. But the 12 additional sets of twins who had arrived over the past 6 months presented challenges that tested every system they had developed. The newest arrivals included the Kowalski twins, Stefan and Stanisław, whose Polish-speaking parents had died in a Chicago factory fire. The Chen twins, May and Lee, abandoned at a San Francisco mission after anti-Chinese violence made their presence dangerous to their surviving relatives. And most recently, the Thompson twins, Rebecca and Rachel, whose mother had died in childbirth and whose father had surrendered them rather than face the shame of raising children he couldn't afford to feed. Each pair brought not just additional care requirements, but cultural and linguistic challenges that forced the sanctuary to evolve far beyond its original scope. Their staff now included Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant hired specifically to help the Kowalski twins maintain connection to their heritage. Lin Wei, a Chinese scholar whose knowledge of traditional medicine complemented Dr. Warner's Western approaches. And Pastor Gabriel Morrison, whose theological training proved surprisingly useful in helping children process grief and loss. "Miss Sullivan," called Sarah Chen, no relation to the photographer Robert Chen, who had documented their early success, as she approached across the courtyard. Sarah served as their educational coordinator, a position that had evolved from teaching basic skills to developing individualized learning programs for children whose backgrounds ranged from urban immigrant families to isolated prairie homesteads. "We need to discuss the Harrison twins," Sarah continued, referring to the most recent arrivals. "Timothy and Thomas are showing signs of developmental delays that may require specialized intervention beyond what our current staff can provide." The Harrison case illustrated the complexity their success had created. Word of the sanctuary's innovative approaches had spread throughout the Midwest, leading desperate families to seek placement for children whose needs went far beyond simple orphan care. Timothy and Thomas had been born premature to a mother weakened by malnutrition, resulting in physical and cognitive development that lagged significantly behind their chronological age. Dr. Sinclair mentioned during her last visit that the university medical school might be willing to provide consultation services, Maggie replied, though she knew that accessing such expertise would require navigating bureaucracies that viewed their unconventional operation with suspicion. "That's encouraging, but it raises larger questions about our mission," Sarah said. "Are we specifically a sanctuary for healthy twins who need family-style care, or are we becoming a specialized institution for children with complex needs?" The question struck at the heart of challenges that kept Maggie awake during increasingly rare quiet moments. Their success had attracted attention from social reformers, medical researchers and government officials throughout the region. all of whom saw their operation as proof that their particular theories about child welfare were correct, but each group's interpretation of their success led to different expectations about what services they should provide and which children they should accept. Medical researchers wanted them to focus on studying twin development patterns. Social reformers wanted them to demonstrate that institutional care could be made more humane. Government officials wanted them to serve as a model that could be replicated throughout the territorial system. The truth is, Sarah, I'm not sure we get to choose our mission anymore, Maggie admitted. Every success creates expectations from people who have the power to support or destroy what we're building. Our challenge is staying true to what matters most while managing all these competing demands. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure, Dr. Warner, whose monthly visits had become essential for maintaining both medical standards and political relationships that kept their operation viable. But today she was accompanied by someone unexpected, a well-dressed woman in her 40s whose bearing suggested both authority and tragedy. Miss Sullivan, Mrs. Hendricks, Dr. Warner called as she approached with her companion. I'd like you to meet Mrs. Catherine Adams from the Colorado Children's Welfare Commission. She's here because of something extraordinary that's happened in Denver. Mrs. Adams stepped forward with the careful composure of someone delivering news that would change everything. Ladies, 6 months ago, a businessman named Jonathan Pierce read Dr. Sinclair's articles about your work here. Mr. Pierce has twin daughters who were struggling in traditional schools, and your approaches to maintaining twin bonds while fostering individual development gave him ideas about how to help them. She paused, studying the children playing around them before continuing. Mr. Pierce has established a foundation specifically dedicated to creating similar sanctuaries throughout the Western Territories. He's prepared to fund 5 additional facilities modeled on your operation, and he wants your input on site selection, staff training, and operational procedures. The implications were staggering. Their experimental sanctuary could become the cornerstone of a regional network that would transform how society approached the care of twin children throughout the American frontier. But expansion on such a scale would require expertise, resources, and administrative capabilities far beyond what their current operation possessed. Mrs. Adams, Mary said carefully, we've learned that caring for twins requires very specific skills and approaches that can't easily be taught through manuals or brief training sessions. How would Mr. Pierce ensure that new facilities maintain the quality standards that make our approach successful? That's exactly why I'm here, Mrs. Adams replied. Mr. Pierce wants to establish a training center here at your facility where prospective staff from new sanctuaries would spend 6 months learning your methods before taking positions elsewhere. You would become not just a sanctuary, but an educational institution that prepares others to replicate your work. The proposal was flattering and terrifying in equal measure. Training others would require systematizing approaches that had developed organically through trial and error, creating formal curricula from intuitive responses to children's needs, and establishing standards that could be maintained across multiple locations by people they might never personally supervise. There's more, Dr. Warner added, her expression suggesting that additional complications were coming. The territorial government has been watching Mr. Pierce's foundation activities, and they're concerned about private organizations taking over functions they believe should remain under public control. What does that mean for us? Maggie asked, though she suspected the answer would involve the kind of political maneuvering that had always made her uncomfortable. It means we need to navigate carefully between private foundation support and government oversight, Dr. Warner replied. Both groups want to claim credit for our success, and both have the power to cause serious problems if they feel excluded from future developments. The meeting that followed in their new administrative building revealed the complexity of success they had never anticipated. Maps covered the walls, showing potential sites for new sanctuaries throughout Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota territories. Financial projections outlined budgets that dwarfed their current operation. Staffing charts suggested hierarchies and specializations that would transform their family-like sanctuary into something resembling a corporate structure. The fundamental question, Mrs. Adams said as they reviewed the expansion plans, is whether you believe your approach can maintain its effectiveness. When scaled up to serve hundreds of children across multiple locations, it was a question that struck at everything. They had learned about what made their sanctuary successful. The personal relationships between caregivers and children, the intimate knowledge of each twin pair's unique characteristics, the flexibility to adapt approaches based on individual needs. All of these seemed to depend on the small scale and family atmosphere they had worked so hard to create. "Mrs. Adams," Maggie said finally, "before we discuss expansion, I think you need to understand what we've learned about why our approach works." She led the group to the original nursery, where the first 14 babies, now energetic toddlers, were engaged in activities that illustrated the principles underlying their entire operation. Samuel and Seth, the boys who had developed their own communication system as infants, were working together on a building project that required coordination and compromise. Emma and Eleanor, who had learned to take turns being fussy as babies, now showed the same instinctive cooperation in sharing toys and attention from adults. "What you're seeing isn't the result of any curriculum or training program," Maggie explained. "It's the outcome of consistent, loving attention from adults who know each child's individual personality and understand how twin relationships develop when they're not artificially separated." Mary joined the explanation, pointing out details that might be missed by casual observers. "Notice how Maria and Michael still move in synchronization, even though they're now walking independently. That connection was formed when they were infants sharing a crib, and it's been reinforced by caregivers who understood that their bond was a strength to be supported, not a dependency to be broken." The demonstration continued throughout the afternoon, as Mrs. Adams observed, interactions that revealed the sophisticated understanding of child development their staff had developed through daily experience. The seamless cooperation between caregivers from different cultural backgrounds, the individualized approaches to education that accommodated each child's learning style, and most importantly, the obvious happiness and security displayed by children who had experienced trauma before arriving at the sanctuary. "This is remarkable," Mrs. Adams admitted as they concluded the tour. "But it also raises the question of whether such individualized attention can be maintained when you're training staff for facilities hundreds of miles away. Maybe the question isn't whether we can train people to do exactly what we do," Sarah Chen suggested. "Maybe the question is whether we can teach people to develop their own version of what we do, adapted to their local circumstances and the specific children they serve." The insight shifted the entire discussion in a direction none of them had anticipated. Instead of creating identical replicas of their sanctuary, they could establish a network of related institutions that shared basic principles while adapting methods to local conditions and cultural contexts. "A confederation rather than a corporation," Dr. Warner mused. "Individual sanctuaries that maintain their autonomy while sharing resources, expertise, and support." The concept appealed to everyone involved, but implementing it would require unprecedented cooperation between institutions that had never existed before. They would need to create communication systems, develop shared standards, and establish mechanisms for mutual aid that could function across vast distances in an era when a letter could take weeks to reach its destination. "Mr. Pierce has considered these challenges," Mrs. Adams said, "producing documents that outline support systems designed to address the logistical problems of coordinating multiple facilities. He's prepared to fund a central coordinating office regular conferences where staff from different sanctuaries can share experiences, and even a publication that would allow ongoing communication about best practices and new developments. The scope of what they were contemplating was breathtaking. Their small sanctuary could become the seed of a movement that would transform child welfare practices throughout the American frontier. But success would require skills and commitments that went far beyond caring for the children who had originally brought them together. "Mrs. Adams," Maggie said, as the meeting drew to a close, "we need time to consider what you're proposing. This isn't just about expanding our operation. It's about taking responsibility for the welfare of children we may never meet, in places we may never visit, cared for by people we may never train personally." "I understand," Mrs. Adams replied. "But I hope you'll also consider that the alternative may be losing control of your own innovation. If you don't lead this expansion, others will attempt to replicate your methods without understanding what makes them successful. You have the opportunity to ensure that growth happens in ways that preserve what matters most." As evening fell over the sanctuary, Maggie and Mary found themselves once again facing a decision that would determine not just their own futures, but the futures of countless children throughout the frontier region. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but success had brought responsibilities and opportunities that neither had ever imagined. Standing in the courtyard where 26 children were, enjoying the security and love that had once seemed impossible for 14 abandoned babies, they began planning for a future that would be larger and more complex than anything they had previously attempted. The winter of 1889 brought unexpected visitors to Sullivan City, but these weren't Foundation representatives or government officials seeking to support their work. Standing at the sanctuary's main gate were 3 stern-faced men whose presence radiated authority and disapproval. Reverend Marcus Thornfield from the Iowa Territorial Moral Standards Commission, Judge Harrison Blackwood from the State Judicial Review Board, and most concerning of all, Inspector General Wallace Pike from the Federal Department of Child Welfare Oversight. Maggie watched through the office window as the men surveyed the sanctuary with obvious skepticism. Their arrival had been announced only by a terse telegram the previous evening. "Official inspection tomorrow. Prepare all records. Non-compliance will result in closure proceedings." The threat was clear, but the motivation behind it remained mysterious. Their sanctuary had passed every previous inspection with commendations. Their children showed exceptional development outcomes. Their financial records were meticulously maintained. Yet something had triggered this high-level investigation that could shut down everything they had built. "Miss Sullivan," Dr. Warner said grimly as she joined Maggie at the window, "I've been making inquiries about why this inspection was ordered. What I discovered is deeply troubling." She handed Maggie a collection of newspaper clippings from publications across the Midwest. The headlines told a story of mounting opposition, unnatural child-rearing experiments in Iowa, government fund support, dangerous social engineering, and most damaging, twin children used as laboratory subjects by unqualified women. "Someone has been conducting a coordinated campaign to discredit our work," Dr. Warner continued. "These articles contain enough accurate details about our operation to seem credible, but they're mixed with distortions and accusations that paint us as dangerous radicals conducting unauthorized experiments on helpless children." The articles shared common themes that revealed their coordinated nature. All questioned whether women without formal medical or educational credentials should be allowed to care for so many children. All suggested that keeping twins together violated established child care principles designed to foster independence. Most damaging, all implied that their private foundation funding represented an attempt to circumvent government oversight of child welfare. Who would orchestrate something like this? Mary asked, though her expression suggested she suspected the answer. Would involve people whose opposition to their success ran deeper than professional. Disagreement. The trail leads back to Dr. Cornelius Westbrook and the traditional child. Development Institute, Dr. Warner replied. Dr. Westbrook has been a vocal critic of what he calls sentimental approaches to orphan care. He believes children are best served by institutional discipline that prepares them for adult responsibilities rather than what he considers the coddling approach of family-style care. Dr. Westbrook's opposition represented more than professional disagreement. As director of the largest orphanage system in the Midwest, he controlled the placement of thousands of children and the distribution of millions of dollars in government funding. The success of their sanctuary threatened both his professional reputation and his institutional empire. The inspection began with Reverend Thornfield, demanding to review what he called their moral instruction curriculum, his assumption that institutional childcare required formal religious indoctrination revealed immediately how little he understood their approach. Reverend Mary explained patiently, "We provide moral guidance through daily example and individual attention rather than formal religious instruction. Our children come from diverse religious backgrounds, and we believe their spiritual education should respect their family traditions." "Precisely the problem," Thornfield replied curtly. "Children without firm moral instruction become adults without proper character. Your approach of letting children discover their own values is a recipe for moral confusion and social disorder." Judge Blackwood's concerns focused on what he perceived as inadequate preparation for adult responsibilities during the educational facilities. He criticized their emphasis on creative play and individualized learning as insufficiently rigorous for children who would need to support themselves in the harsh realities of frontier life. "These children are orphans," he observed coldly. "They don't have the luxury of extended childhood that comes with family wealth. They need practical skills and work discipline, not artistic expression and emotional development." "Your Honor," Sarah Chen responded with barely contained frustration, "our children are learning practical skills, but they're also developing the creativity and problem-solving abilities that will serve them throughout their lives. Education isn't just about preparing for immediate employment, it's about developing the capacity to adapt and grow." But it was Inspector Pike who posed the greatest threat. His federal authority gave him the power to shut down their operation immediately if he determined that children were at risk. His methodical examination of their records, procedures, and facilities revealed a mind focused on finding violations rather than understanding innovations. "Miss Sullivan," Pike said as he reviewed their medical records, "I see no evidence of formal psychological evaluations for these children. How do you monitor their mental development without scientific assessment tools?" "Inspector, we monitor their development through daily observation by trained caregivers who know each child individually," Maggie replied. "We document their progress, note concerns, and adapt our approaches based on what we observe." "Isn't that more accurate than periodic testing by strangers?" "What you're describing is subjective opinion, not scientific assessment," Pike countered. "Without standardized testing, you have no way to demonstrate that your methods produce superior outcomes compared to established institutional approaches." The philosophical divide was unbridgeable. Pike represented a worldview that trusted only formal credentials, standardized procedures, and quantifiable results. Their sanctuary embodied an approach that emphasized relationships, individual attention, and outcomes that couldn't be measured by conventional testing. The confrontation escalated when Pike demanded to interview several children privately, claiming he needed to assess whether they showed signs of the psychological damage that critics suggested resulted from their unconventional upbringing. His selection of subjects revealed the calculated nature of his investigation. He chose the children with the most traumatic backgrounds, clearly hoping to find evidence of inadequate care. His first interview was with Stefan Kowalski, one of the Polish twins whose parents had died in the Chicago factory fire. Stefan's initial adjustment to the sanctuary had been difficult, marked by nightmares, withdrawal, and aggressive behavior that required months of patient intervention to address. "Stefan," Pike said through an interpreter, "tell me about the people who take care of you here. Do they ever punish you? Do they make you do things you don't want to do?" The questions were clearly designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as evidence of abuse or coercion. But Stefan's answers revealed something Pike hadn't expected: a child who understood the difference between discipline and punishment, between structure and oppression. "The ladies help me when I'm sad about Mama and Papa," Stefan replied, in his careful English, supplemented by Polish when he lacked vocabulary. "They don't hurt me when I make mistakes. They help me learn to do better." Pike's interview with Mei Chen proved even more revealing. Mei had arrived severely malnourished and showed signs of possible developmental delays that might have resulted from her early trauma. Critics had suggested that children with special needs were being neglected in favor of those who were easier to care for. "Mei," Pike asked, "and do the adults here give you the same attention as the other children, or do they sometimes ignore you because you're different?" Mei's response, delivered in a mixture of English and Chinese with assistance from Lin Wei, demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of fairness that had developed through consistent, respectful treatment. "Everyone gets help with what they need. I need more help with talking. Lee needs more help with walking. We get different help, but we all get help." The interviews continued throughout the day, with Pike clearly growing frustrated as each child demonstrated emotional security, intellectual development, and social skills that contradicted every criticism that had been leveled against their operation. The children showed no signs of the dependency, confusion, or behavioral problems that critics claimed resulted from their approach. The turning point came during Pike's interview with the Harrison twins, Timothy and Thomas, whose developmental delays had initially raised questions about whether the sanctuary could adequately serve children with special needs. Pike clearly expected to find evidence that these children were receiving inadequate care or being used as subjects for inappropriate experimentation. "Timothy," Pike said, speaking slowly as if the child were incapable of understanding normal speech, "are you happy here? Do you wish you could live somewhere else?" Timothy's response revealed both his intellectual capacity and the emotional security that months of patient care had fostered. "This is my home. Thomas is my brother, and everyone here is my family. Why would I want to live somewhere else? But don't you think you might be happier in a place with other children who are more like you?" Pike pressed, clearly fishing for evidence that the twins felt excluded or inadequate. Thomas, who rarely spoke but had been encouraged to express himself through art and music, surprised everyone by answering clearly, "We are like each other. That's what matters." Pike's final interview was with Emma and Eleanor, the twins who had nearly died during the whooping cough outbreak that had tested their operation during the Foundation evaluation. Pike had clearly been briefed about this incident and was probing for evidence that their unconventional treatment had endangered the children. "Emma, do you remember being sick last year?" Pike asked. "Were you scared when the adults put you in the special room?" "I was scared when David was sick and Eleanor couldn't be with me," Emma replied, with the clarity of a child who had processed her experiences through supportive conversations with caring adults. "But when we could be together again, I wasn't scared anymore, even though being together meant you might get sick too." Pike pressed. Eleanor answered this time, "Being apart from Emma makes me sick inside. Being together makes us both strong." The simple wisdom of the children's responses clearly frustrated Pike, who had expected to find evidence of confusion, trauma, or manipulation. Instead, he had discovered children who understood love, support, and family bonds in ways that seemed to surpass many adults' emotional sophistication. That evening, as the three investigators huddled in private conference, tension filled the sanctuary like gathering storm clouds. The staff continued their normal routines, but everyone understood that the next morning could bring an official closure order that would scatter the children among conventional institutions throughout the territory. "Dr. Warner, Maggie said as they sat in the darkened office reviewing the day's events. "What happens to the children if they shut us down?" "The twins will be separated," Dr. Warner replied grimly. "Pike has already made it clear that he considers twin bonding a form of codependency that prevents proper individual development. The children will be distributed among various institutions with specific instructions that siblings be placed separately to encourage independence." The prospect of watching 26 children who had learned to trust in love and security being forced into institutional settings designed to break their bonds was almost unbearable. But it also clarified what they were really fighting for, not just their own vision of childcare, but the welfare of specific children whose lives would be forever altered by the outcome of this investigation. "There's something else," Dr. Warner continued. "I received a telegram today from Jonathan Pierce. Word of this inspection has reached other Foundation supporters throughout the region. If we're shut down, it will effectively end any possibility of establishing similar sanctuaries elsewhere. We're not just fighting for these children, we're fighting for all the children who might benefit from this approach in the future." The stakes couldn't have been higher. Tomorrow would determine whether their revolutionary approach to child welfare would be allowed to continue and grow, or whether it would be destroyed by people who saw innovation as a threat to established order. Everything they had built, everything they had learned, and everything they hoped to accomplish hung in the balance of one man's official report. As Maggie walked through the dormitories, where 26 children slept peacefully, secure in the love and stability they had come to take for granted, she realized that the real battle was just beginning. They had proven their methods worked, but now they had to prove they deserved to exist in a world that often preferred conformity to excellence, regulation to innovation, and fear to hope. The morning of reckoning arrived with an unexpected development that would shift the entire investigation in their favor. As Inspector Pike prepared to deliver his findings, a carriage rolled up to the sanctuary, carrying passengers whose presence would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about their operation. Dr. Margaret Sinclair stepped down from the carriage first, followed by two people whose arrival made Pike visibly uncomfortable: Dr. James Mitchell, Chief of Pediatric Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, and Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the renowned women's rights advocate whose influence in Washington made politicians nervous. "Inspector Pike," Dr. Sinclair said with professional courtesy that barely concealed her displeasure, "I understand you're conducting an evaluation of this facility without consulting any of the medical professionals who have been documenting its outcomes." Pike's response revealed the political pressure he was under. "Dr. Sinclair, this investigation was ordered by federal authorities concerned about reports of experimental procedures being conducted on children without proper oversight." "What experimental procedures?" Dr. Mitchell interjected, his tone sharp with the authority of someone accustomed to challenging baseless medical claims. "I've reviewed every medical record from this facility. Their approaches are innovative, but they're based on sound developmental principles that any competent physician would recognize." Mrs. Stanton's intervention proved even more pointed. "Inspector, I've also reviewed the reports that triggered this investigation. They contain serious factual errors and appear designed to discredit work that challenges traditional institutional approaches. Before you issue any findings, I suggest you examine the motives of those who requested this inquiry." The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of the political forces arrayed against them. Pike was forced to admit that his investigation had been prompted by complaints from Dr. Westbrook's Traditional Child Development Institute. Complaints that alleged violations of federal standards that didn't actually exist. "Inspector," Dr. Mitchell said after reviewing Pike's preliminary findings, "you've documented no medical violations, no educational deficiencies, and no evidence of child abuse or neglect. Your concerns appear to focus entirely on the fact that these women are using methods different from institutional norms." "Innovation isn't grounds for closure," Mrs. Stanton added firmly. especially when that innovation is producing superior outcomes for the children involved. But the most powerful defense came from an unexpected source. Word of the investigation had spread throughout the network of families who had benefited from the sanctuary's services, prompting an unprecedented gathering of support that overwhelmed Pike's ability to maintain his detached official stance. The first to arrive was Jonathan Pierce himself, whose foundation funding had made their expansion possible. But he was followed by a stream of visitors whose personal stories challenged every assumption underlying the investigation. Parents who had visited and seen their own twins thriving under approaches that had been unavailable elsewhere. Former staff members who had left to establish successful childcare programs in other communities. And most compelling, young adults who had been raised in various institutional settings and could speak directly to the differences in outcomes. "Inspector Pike," Pierce said, addressing the formal hearing that Dr. Sinclair had demanded, "I've spent considerable time and money researching child welfare approaches throughout this country. What Miss Sullivan and Mrs. Hendricks have created represents the most successful innovation in childcare I've encountered." He produced a thick folder of documentation. These are comparative studies showing development outcomes for children in traditional institutions versus children in family-style care. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the approaches you're attempting to shut down. The hearing continued with testimony that systematically dismantled every criticism that had been leveled against their operation. Dr. Mitchell presented medical evidence showing superior health outcomes among their children. Sarah Chen provided educational assessments demonstrating advanced learning compared to age-matched peers in conventional schools. Linway offered cultural integration, data showing how children from diverse backgrounds had thrived while maintaining connections to their heritage. But the most powerful testimony came from the children themselves, whose responses to questions revealed emotional and intellectual development that exceeded what anyone might have expected from children with their traumatic backgrounds. 8-year-old Samuel Kowalski, speaking in fluent English supplemented by Polish when he wanted to emphasize important points, addressed Inspector Pike directly. "Sir, before I came here, I was angry all the time because my parents died and nobody understood me. Now I know that bad things happen, but good people help you get through them." His twin brother Seth added, "We don't want to live anywhere else. This is our family now, and families stay together." The Chen twins, now comfortable expressing themselves in both English and Chinese, demonstrated the kind of cultural confidence that traditional assimilation-focused institutions rarely achieved. "We remember our Chinese heritage," May explained, "but we're also American children. Miss Sullivan and Mrs. Hendricks taught us that we can be both." Emma and Eleanor, the survivors of the whooping cough crisis, provided perhaps the most compelling testimony about the importance of twin bonding. "When one of us hurts, the other one hurts too," Emma explained, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had impressed every adult who worked with them. "Separating twins is like cutting a person in half," Judge Blackwood, who had arrived skeptical of their educational approaches, found himself questioning his own assumptions as he observed the children's sophisticated understanding of complex concepts. These weren't the dependent, poorly prepared children he had expected to find. Instead, they demonstrated independence, creativity, and problem-solving skills that surpassed many children from traditional backgrounds. "Miss Sullivan," he said during a break in the proceedings, "I must admit that my concerns about inadequate preparation for adult responsibilities appear to have been misplaced. These children show remarkable maturity and adaptability. Even Reverend Thornfield found his moral instruction. Concerns challenged by children whose behavior reflected, internalized, values rather than externally imposed rules. The twins consistently demonstrated kindness, honesty, and mutual support without the rigid discipline he considered essential for character development. Perhaps, he admitted reluctantly to Mary, there are multiple paths to moral development. Your children certainly display the virtues we hope to instill, even if your methods differ from traditional approaches. The turning point came when Inspector Pike attempted to question the Harrison twins about their special needs care. Timothy and Thomas, whose developmental delays had initially raised concerns about the sanctuary's ability to serve children with complex requirements, demonstrated progress that contradicted every assumption about institutional versus family-style care. "Timothy," Pike asked, "do you understand that you learn differently from some of the other children?" "I learn slower with some things and faster with others," Timothy replied thoughtfully. "Thomas is the same way, but different things are slow and fast for him. Miss Sarah helps us learn in ways that work for us." Thomas, whose communication had improved dramatically through individualized attention, added his own perspective. "Everyone here learns differently. The teachers help everyone find their own way." Their responses revealed something that traditional institutions rarely achieved. Children with special needs, who understood their differences without feeling inferior, who received appropriate support without being segregated from their peers, and who maintained their twin bond while developing individual capabilities. Dr. Sinclair used the Harrison case to make a broader point about the sanctuary's approaches. "Inspector, these boys have made more progress in 18 months of individualized care than most children with similar challenges achieve in years of institutional treatment. Their success illustrates why family-style care produces superior outcomes." As the hearing progressed, Pike found himself increasingly isolated in his opposition. The evidence for the sanctuary's success was overwhelming. The testimony from experts was unanimous in their support and most damaging to his case. His own observations contradicted the allegations that had prompted his investigation. The final blow to Pike's case came from an unexpected source. A telegram from Dr. Westbrook himself, whose traditional Child Development Institute was facing its own federal investigation, prompted by Mrs. Stanton's inquiries into their practices. "Inspector," Mrs. Stanton announced. Reading from the telegram, "Dr. Westbrook is withdrawing his complaints against this facility. It appears his own institution is under scrutiny for practices that actually do violate federal standards." The revelation that their primary critic was himself facing charges of inadequate care, financial mismanagement, and child welfare violations effectively ended Pike's investigation. He could hardly shut down a facility for alleged violations while the source of those allegations was being investigated for actual violations. Pike's final report, delivered with obvious reluctance, cleared the sanctuary of all charges and recommended that their approaches be studied as a model for improving child welfare throughout the federal system. But more than bureaucratic vindication, the investigation had provided something unexpected, a platform to demonstrate their success to a national audience. News of the hearing spread through newspapers across the country, transforming their local sanctuary into a symbol of innovative American approaches to social problems. Articles praised their combination of practical care with emotional support, their integration of diverse cultural backgrounds, and their demonstration that women could excel in fields traditionally reserved for male professionals. "Miss Sullivan," Dr. Mitchell said, as the official proceedings concluded, "Johns Hopkins would like to establish a formal partnership with your sanctuary. We want to document your methods, study your outcomes, and train our own pediatric residents in family-style care approaches." The offer represented recognition from the most prestigious medical institution in the country, validation that their work deserved serious academic attention rather than bureaucratic harassment. Mrs. Stanton's offer proved equally significant. "I want to feature your work in my upcoming book about women's capabilities in professional fields. You've proven that women can excel in child welfare, education, and administration while maintaining the nurturing qualities that make them particularly effective in these roles." But the most meaningful recognition came from Jonathan Pierce, whose foundation was prepared to expand their support far beyond anything previously discussed. Miss Sullivan, Mrs. Hendricks, you've proven that your approach can withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. Now I want to help you prove it can transform child welfare across the entire frontier. His new proposal was breathtaking in scope. Funding for 25 sanctuaries throughout the Western Territories, a training institute that would prepare hundreds of staff members, and a coordinating network that would maintain quality standards while allowing local adaptation. You've won more than this investigation, Pierce continued. You've won the right to lead a movement that will change how America cares for its most vulnerable children, standing in the courtyard where 26 children played under the supervision of staff whose expertise had been validated by national authorities. Maggie realized that their greatest challenges lay not behind them, but ahead. They had proven their worth, but now they had to prove their vision could reshape an entire nation's approach to child welfare. The sanctuary had survived its first major crisis, but victory had brought responsibilities that would test them in ways they had never imagined. They were no longer just caring for children, they were pioneering a movement that would define the future of American social reform. 25 years had passed since that frozen February morning when Maggie Sullivan first discovered 14 babies in an abandoned cabin. Standing now on the steps of the Iowa State Capitol, she watched as Governor Robert Lucas signed legislation that would establish the Sullivan-Hendricks twin family network as the official model for child welfare throughout the newly formed state. The woman who had once worked 16-hour days for subsistence wages had become one of the most influential social reformers in American history. But more importantly, the frightened babies she and Mary had rescued had grown into remarkable adults whose lives embodied everything they had hoped to achieve. The ceremony was attended by dignitaries from across the nation, but Maggie's attention focused on the group seated in the front rows, the original 14 children, now adults whose accomplishments had exceeded every expectation. Samuel and Seth Kowalski had established a successful engineering firm that specialized in building schools and hospitals throughout the frontier territories. Their projects consistently incorporated innovative design features that accommodated the needs of children with diverse backgrounds and abilities. Emma and Eleanor Chen had become the first twin sisters to graduate from medical school, with Emma specializing in pediatric care and Eleanor pioneering research into twin psychology. Their joint practice in San Francisco served the immigrant communities that faced the same challenges their own family had encountered decades earlier. Maria and Michael Henderson, they had chosen to take Mary's surname when they reached adulthood, had founded a teacher training college that prepared educators to work with children from traumatic backgrounds. Their innovative curricula had been adopted by normal schools throughout the western states. Timothy and Thomas Harrison had perhaps surprised everyone most of all. The boys whose developmental delays had once raised questions about the sanctuary's capabilities had become successful authors whose books about overcoming childhood challenges inspired readers across the country. Their memoir, Together We Are Strong, had become required reading in social work programs nationwide. Each pair of twins had chosen different paths, but all shared common characteristics that revealed the lasting impact of their early care: confidence without arrogance, independence without isolation, and an unwavering commitment to helping others who faced challenges similar to those they had overcome. "Miss Sullivan," called a familiar voice from the crowd. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, now in her 70s but still sharp and energetic, approached with a thick folder of documents. "I have the final report on the network's 25-year outcomes. The statistics were remarkable. The Sullivan-Hendricks model had been implemented in 43 facilities across 22 states, serving over 3,000 sets of twins and their siblings. Academic achievement rates exceeded national averages by significant margins. Criminal behavior among their graduates was virtually non-existent. Most importantly, follow-up studies showed that 94% of the twins maintained close relationships with their siblings throughout adulthood, compared to less than 60% for twins separated in traditional institutional care. But the numbers don't tell the real story, Dr. Warner continued, opening the folder to reveal letters from former residents throughout the network. These do. The letters painted a picture of lives transformed, not just by the care they had received, but by the example they had witnessed. Many had become teachers, social workers, doctors, and reformers who carried forward the values they had learned in their sanctuary homes. They established their own innovative programs, adopted children from difficult circumstances, and consistently chose careers that involved helping others. Dr. Warner, Mary said, joining their conversation with her characteristic quiet dignity, "What do you think we accomplished?" Mary's question reflected the humility that had never left her despite recognition that had made her one of the most respected women in America. At 68, she still lived at the original sanctuary, which had become the training center for staff from facilities throughout the network. Her gentle wisdom and practical experience had shaped thousands of caregivers who carried her approaches to children across the continent. "You proved something that social reformers had argued about for decades," Dr. Warner replied. "You demonstrated that love and individual attention could overcome almost any disadvantage, and that family-style care produced better outcomes than institutional discipline." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman whose presence represented the network's continued evolution. Rebecca Martinez was the first graduate of their new social work training program, designed specifically to prepare professionals for working with immigrant families and children from non-English speaking backgrounds. "Mrs. Hendricks, Miss Sullivan," Rebecca said formally, "I wanted to thank you personally before I leave for California. The position at the Los Angeles Sanctuary will allow me to help Mexican-American families who are facing the same discrimination my own family encountered." Rebecca's story illustrated how their work had adapted to address changing social challenges. As immigration increased and cultural tensions mounted throughout the western states, their network had pioneered approaches to maintaining cultural identity while fostering American integration. Children learned English without losing their native languages, celebrated American holidays while maintaining ethnic traditions, and developed pride in their heritage rather than shame about their differences. "Rebecca," Maggie said warmly, "remember that every family you help carries forward everything we've learned together. You're not just serving those children, you're showing other communities what's possible when people choose love over fear." The ceremony's highlight came when Governor Lucas invited Maggie to address the gathered crowd about the legislation that would secure the network's future. Standing at the podium, where politicians typically delivered partisan speeches, she chose instead to tell a story that captured everything they had accomplished. 25 years ago, I was a woman with nothing, no family, no prospects, no hope for anything beyond surviving another day, she began, her voice carrying easily across the crowd. Mary Hendricks was a mother who had lost everything, her husband, her children, her reason for living. She paused, looking out at faces that included former residents, staff members, supporters, and critics who had come to witness this historical moment. "We came together in the most unlikely circumstances, brought by 14 babies who needed more than either of us could provide alone. What we discovered was that impossible situations sometimes create extraordinary opportunities." The speech continued with stories that illustrated the principles underlying their entire approach. The importance of keeping families together whenever possible, the value of individualized attention over standardized procedures, and the transformative power of believing in children's potential rather than limiting their futures based on their backgrounds. "But our greatest discovery," Maggie concluded, "was that building something lasting requires more than good intentions. It requires the courage to challenge conventional wisdom when that wisdom fails to serve the people who need help most. The legislation Governor Lucas signed that afternoon established endowments that would ensure the network's financial stability, professional standards that would maintain quality across all facilities, and legal protections that would prevent future attempts to shut down their operations for political reasons. More importantly, it established the principle that child welfare policies should be based on demonstrated outcomes rather than institutional preferences. The success of their family-style approach had forced lawmakers to acknowledge that innovation deserved protection from bureaucratic resistance to change. As evening approached and the official ceremonies concluded, Maggie and Mary found themselves back at the original sanctuary, walking through buildings that had evolved far beyond the simple cabin where their story began. The current residents, 38, children ranging from infants to teenagers, were engaged in activities that would have seemed revolutionary 25 years earlier, but had become standard practice throughout their network. Twins were learning together while developing individual interests. Children from diverse cultural backgrounds were sharing traditions while building common bonds. Teenagers who had arrived as traumatized toddlers were preparing for college, careers, and adult lives that would have been impossible without the foundation they had received. Maggie, Mary said as they sat on the porch where they had spent countless evenings planning for the future. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come looking for that smoke from my chimney? The question had haunted both women throughout their partnership, representing all the children who might have been lost if circumstances had been slightly different. But it also represented their understanding that individual choices could create ripple effects that touched countless lives in ways that could never be fully measured. I think those babies would have found another way to survive. Maggie replied thoughtfully. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for. But I don't think we would have discovered what we were capable of accomplishing. Together, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter from the playground, where the current residents were enjoying the evening before bedtime routines began. Among them were the newest arrivals, 3 sets of twins whose parents had died in a railroad accident. Children whose trauma and loss echoed the experiences of every child who had found sanctuary in this place. The work continues, Mary observed, watching staff members whose training incorporated 25 years of refined techniques and accumulated wisdom. Every generation of children teaches us something new about what they need to thrive. As night fell over the sanctuary, lights began appearing in windows throughout the complex. In the nursery, infants were being fed and comforted by caregivers whose expertise had been developed through decades of experience. In the dormitories, school-aged children were completing homework assignments designed to challenge them individually while building collaborative skills. In the common areas, teenagers were engaged in activities that prepared them for adult independence while maintaining the supportive relationships that would sustain them throughout their lives. The empire of joy that Maggie and Mary had built extended far beyond the physical structures surrounding them. It lived in the thousands of children whose lives had been transformed by the care they received, in the communities throughout the nation that had adopted their approaches, and in the fundamental change in how American society understood the needs of orphaned and abandoned children. But perhaps most importantly, it lived in the simple recognition that love was not a luxury that children could receive only after their basic needs were met, but a fundamental requirement that made everything else possible. The woman who had discovered 14 babies in an abandoned cabin had learned that building an empire required not conquest, but compassion, not dominance, but service, not profit, but the simple joy that comes from watching children grow into the remarkable adults they were always meant to become. As Maggie Sullivan, who had never married but had been mother to hundreds, prepared for sleep in the room where she had spent the past 25 years, She reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from isolation to influence, from poverty to purpose, from despair to the kind of joy that could only come from devoting one's life to something greater than personal happiness. The 14 babies who had changed everything were now adults with children of their own, many of whom were being raised with the same principles that had shaped their parents' early years. The cycle continued, carrying forward the revolutionary idea that every child deserved not just survival, but the opportunity to thrive in an environment where individual differences were celebrated rather than suppressed, where siblings' bonds were honored rather than broken, and where love was understood as the foundation upon which all other learning was built. The empire of joy would continue growing, touching lives in ways that its founders could never have imagined, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary legacies begin with the simplest decision to help a child in need. Margaret Sullivan had answered that call, and in doing so had changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless children whose futures had been made brighter by her courage to believe that impossible situations could become extraordinary opportunities. The story had no ending, because the work of building joy would continue as long as there were children who needed someone to believe in their potential and fight for their right to grow up, surrounded by love rather than limited by circumstances beyond their control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.